In today's video, we're going to be talking a little bit more about marijuana. Be sure to check out our other videos, all talking about marijuana, pot, weed, Mary Jane, all things cannabis. We're specifically going to be talking about marijuana versus hemp. Now, no one has ever mistakenly thought that Florida is a bastion of liberal laws. And so it comes as no surprise that under Florida law, the possession of marijuana remains a crime. Florida Statute 893.13 specifically criminalizes the possession of marijuana. Now, marijuana is simply known as the cannabis sativa plant. Any amount of marijuana up until recently was illegal to possess. Under the statute, possession of less than 20 grams was a misdemeanor. How did they come up with 20 grams? I don't know, they must have thought it was a nice round number. Many states will have a marker at 1 ounce or maybe 3 ounces for different levels of criminality when it came to marijuana. Now, many states have decriminalized marijuana or fully legalized marijuana for at least medical purposes, if not recreational purposes. And even though Florida has legalized marijuana for medical purposes, it remains criminal to possess marijuana of any kind under Florida Statute 893.13. Possession of 20 grams or more of marijuana is a felony punishable by up to 5 years. So Florida's always been extra tough and severe when it came to marijuana. However, in 2018, the Florida legislature passed a farm bill mimicking some of the provisions that were in the federal government's farm bill. Specifically, in that 2018 bill, Florida legalized hemp and created a State of Florida hemp program. The hemp program can be found in Florida Statute 581.27, and in this bill, it legalized the possession of hemp. Now, hemp was defined as cannabis sativa, the exact same thing as marijuana. The only difference is that hemp is defined by Florida law as having less than 0.3% THC of its total combined dry weight. That's an extremely small amount of THC, the psychoactive compound in marijuana that generally gives people the high feeling. The 0.3% THC found is so low, a person would probably not feel anything if they smoked it, ate it, or did anything with it. But it's important to remember that it still has some THC. In cases where police are testing suspected drugs before they've made an arrest, they often use something called a roadside test. This is a test that's small and portable that can be kept in their car. Oftentimes, it involves a liquid called a reagent, where they add a tiny portion of the suspected drug or narcotic to the reagent. And if the reagent turns into a color, then it's positive for drugs. And depending on what color tells them what kind of drug it might be. So for one of these roadside tests for suspected marijuana, it would test positive if it contains THC. Those roadside tests won't tell a police officer how much THC is in it. It will only tell them if there's THC in it or not. Now, generally, Florida law has required a more sophisticated laboratory analysis for felony level drugs, but generally a roadside test and an officer's common knowledge and experience was enough to identify marijuana because it was a plant. In the same way that if they have the personal knowledge, they could identify oregano or basil. Being a plant, the officer can just rely on their own knowledge and education and experiences combined with the roadside test to testify. But with the passage of the Farm Bill legalizing hemp, that roadside test is now insufficient. No officer is going to be able to satisfy the court's high legal requirements in being able to offer an expert opinion whether marijuana has more or less 0.3% THC based on the smell alone or their visual appearance alone. And because the roadside test will only test positive or negative, yes or no for the presence of THC, it's going to be insufficient for being able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt whether the suspected marijuana is in fact the criminal kind of marijuana and not the legal hemp. This presents both good news and bad news. The good news is it is now extremely hard for prosecutors to prove possession of marijuana in a criminal case. Even without considering the legal defense of having a medical marijuana card, where it's perfectly legal to possess marijuana for medical purposes if they have a permit. Now, it's much more difficult for the state to prove regardless, because those roadside tests are not going to be sufficient. Now, of course, the police in the state of Florida could, if they wanted to, send marijuana to a lab for specialized chemical analysis to determine the percentage of THC in the dry weight of the marijuana. However, we're talking about multiple government bureaucracies here. Most laboratory testing of drugs is going to be conducted by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. They do test drugs such as cocaine or heroin for what the substance is. And they will actually do a digital weigh of marijuana if it's suspected to be 20 grams or more because it's a felony. But drug cases are already a relatively low priority for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. The truth is, they spend much more time investigating and doing analysis as it relates to fingerprints and DNA in serious cases such as sexual battery or murder. They do the testing of firearms. And so, although they do test for drugs, that's already a low priority. And on top of it, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, like most government agencies, are very overworked. It's very rare in my practice and experience to find that the police or that the state of Florida are having FDLE test marijuana for the percentage of THC. The result, and the good news, is that most marijuana cases are likely to be ultimately dismissed. The downside is that doesn't stop the police from arresting people. People are still being arrested throughout the state of Florida every single day for possession of marijuana, even though ultimately those charges might get dismissed and probably will get dismissed due to the passage of legalized hemp in Florida. Police will often arrest simply based on a finding of probable cause. And as we've discussed in another video, probable cause is a very low standard. It's simply whether it's probable that a crime has occurred and this person has committed it. So police officers, when they find someone in possession of marijuana or suspected marijuana, and that person doesn't have a medical marijuana license, they'll still arrest that person for possession of marijuana, even though the long run, that case may not go anywhere. But in the short run, the person is still being arrested. They're going to be humiliated. They're going to be booked into jail. They're going to be strip searched. They're going to probably have to pay for a bond to get out of jail. They might have missed work as a result of going to jail. You can see in our other videos where we talk about all of the collateral consequences that come from being arrested. And so a person is going to have all of those challenges by being arrested for marijuana. And even though ultimately those charges might go away, they still have to make the decision whether or not to hire a private defense attorney, whether or not it's worth it to not have to take time off of work to go to court, and whether or not they trust whether the prosecutors and the courts are actually going to fulfill it. After all, because we know that appeal courts exist, judges might make mistakes every day. In fact, there are judges who make mistakes every day, not because they're bad judges, but because they're human, and because reasonable people can disagree. And there might be judges out there certainly are prosecutors out there, who believe that maybe they can still prove that marijuana is the illegal kind of marijuana over 0.3% THC based on some other kind of evidence. The prosecutors might play a game of chicken and push it to the limit a little bit. It really sucks for people that they have to go through the trauma of being arrested, pay the expense of bonding out, have other consequences affecting their life because now they're subject to being released from jail, and still having to make the decision whether or not to hire an attorney to protect their rights and look out for their interests, all because the Florida laws are written pretty poorly. As a side fun fact, Florida has one of the lowest percentages of legislatures in the country comprised of lawyers. It's probably just a coincidence that we have so few lawyers in our legislature, but also so many poorly or vaguely written laws. So unfortunately, the Florida legislature has pulled a bit of a Florida man situation here, and Florida is now an outlier for the rest of the country, where we have some of the most harsh, severe, and draconian laws for marijuana. We do have, fortunately, the hemp laws that will protect people and ultimately help many cases for marijuana get dismissed. But unfortunately, it comes up with the flip side of people still having to suffer those consequences. I don't want to harsh your mellow and ruin your 420. I'm sounding like an old a square here, right?
The kid is a L7 weenie.
You don't want to have a good time turn into a risk of jail time. And even though the law has caught up a little bit in Florida, there are still a lot of pitfalls and the law hasn't caught up completely. And so police can arrest people all the time for suspected possession of marijuana. So you still want to make sure you watch our other videos about what to do when talking to the police or whether or not to consent to searches. Spoiler alert, don't talk to the police and don't consent to a search, but watch those other Lucid Legal videos to get more information about why. We've got more great marijuana videos coming to you to celebrate for April's 420. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion about hemp versus marijuana in the state of Florida. Be sure to like this video, hit the like button, share it on social media, and don't forget to subscribe to Lucid Legal's channel on YouTube. Thank you, and be sure to stay tuned for more videos. Post on our YouTube channel some questions because you never know, your questions might be featured in our next video.